I want to invite you into a mystery this afternoon. Before I do that, I kind of do like to get a read of the room when I do these presentations. So how many of you know a little bit about I'm not going to ask this front table to not answer any of these questions. How many of you know a little bit about the shroud? Oh, great. Okay. How many of you know a lot about it? How many of you could get up here and give this presentation? Just to be sure I know what I'm dealing with this afternoon. I do want to invite you into a mystery. So what we're going to do is actually kind of build with very basic information and then walk through kind of a chronological, but also framed within the science. The chronology of history is very important to being able to understand the science that we're going to be talking about. And then I'll lead you to sort of a natural ending point with a question that leaves us all in mystery. And I think that's the whole point of talking about this relic, this artifact, this object. However one views it, it's a real physical object, but it actually is like nothing else that we know on the planet Earth. And you'll see why, I think, very quickly. So for those of you who don't know anything about it, or very little about it, I want to begin very basically by talking about basics. It's a 14.5-foot strip of linen cloth. It bears the forensically accurate image of a man who has been scourged and crucified in Roman fashion. We believe that it has been subjected to more academic study than any other object that we know to exist. It's certainly, in my field of history, it's been subjected to more academic scrutiny than anything I am aware of, any other archaeological or historical artifact. And yet, it's sort of the philosophical challenge we have with it. It's kind of the inverse of the way academic inquiry works. The more that we study something academically, the more we should be able to understand it. And actually, the inverse is true with this particular artifact, is that the more that we study it, the more we begin to realize that its essence, its most important question everyone has about it, remains a great mystery to us. So that's why I say I want to talk about from this aspect of mystery, because we're not interested in the linen, this 14.5-foot strip of linen. We're not interested in it because it's a beautiful linen, although it is. It's a very unique, unusual, unique piece of linen. It's quite beautiful to look at. We're not interested in it because it is an artwork, and we'll talk about all the reasons it's not an artwork. We're interested in it because it has an image, and it's the image that compels us to learn more about it. So when we're working on developing the exhibit at the Museum of the Bible, and I always like to say this because I actually appropriated this video from them. This is a challenge I think many people have when they look upon the shroud and they see a frontal image on this 14.5-foot strip of linen. They see a frontal image running one direction, and they see the dorsal or the back image of this man running the other way on the inside of the linen. It's difficult sometimes, I think, for people to orient themselves to the image itself. So one of the things that the Museum of the Bible did immediately when we realized this was developed a very simple animation to explain that to you. Okay, so imagine you placed a body in a 14.5-foot strip of linen and you enshrouded it this way. Okay, everybody kind of got that visual now in your mind? So when this image is formed and the body is enshrouded this way, you can naturally then begin to understand how there is an image on one side. When you open the linen, there's a frontal image running this way and there's a dorsal image running the other. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? Everybody can orient themselves to that? Okay. All right. So these are the questions everybody wants to know. Where did the shroud come from? Who created it? What can we know about it? Historically, scientifically, forensically? And how does it mirror the gospel accounts? Because here's the thing. Again, going back to what or who this image might be in the shroud, remember that there are very distinctive characteristics. I laid them out very quickly. This is someone who has been scourged and crucified. This man, whose image is in this cloth, has been capped with something thorny on his head. He's been pierced in the right side, right between the 5th and 6th ribs. So it's not like anyone looks at that image and goes, oh my gosh, I wonder who that's supposed to be. There's no question about who it represents. The question then becomes, how does it mirror the person we think it could be? Which is obviously the man of the Gospels, the man of the shroud being the man of the Gospels. So how does it mirror that? That's a great question. We have some emerging science that I'm going to touch upon very briefly. Again, I would want to caution you, and this is a general caution I give, that science requires a consensus building effort. So a lot of what we thought we understood about the shroud in the 70s and 80s, there's kind of been a paradigm shift in some of those sciences to cause us to look at it a different way. But what I want to tell you is that there is some emerging information that I think is quite exciting that's going on in shroud studies today. So for instance, there is some emerging information about the geographic origin of the flax that was grown to produce the linen. This is very preliminary, but I'm going to share that with you, and I think it's encouraging, it's exciting, and it also points to a new way that we can use to assess something we hadn't previously thought about the shroud that might tell us more about it. So this is preliminary information. We also have new scientific dating methods that are emerging that are based on measuring, instead of a non-destructive carbon-14 dating process, this method actually uses a measurement of the deterioration rate of the cellulose in the fibers of the linen. So in other words, if you have a 20-year-old piece of linen, there's a predictable amount of deterioration of the cellulose in those fibers. The same is true if you have a 2,000-year-old piece of linen, for instance, you can measure that and get an approximate date. So there's a lot of work going on right now, particularly in Italy, regarding this particular method. And then finally, we're also getting sort of new confirmation of something we've kind of always known, but there are specific blood markers that point us to this person having been subjected to physical torture immediately before his death, okay? So I'll talk about all that as briefly as I can. So the documented historical timeline, you had to know that if you're going to have a history professor, you're going to get a little bit of a history lesson, right? You had to know that. But this is necessary context to understand something centrally important to the shroud. It does not show up in the documented timeline until the middle of the 14th century. And what I'm saying is, this is the point of entry into the official historical record that no one disputes. I am in no way suggesting to you that the shroud did not exist before the 14th century. I personally don't think that's true. But it enters the record in an undisputed way in the 14th century. And then it's interesting because there's a history that follows it that is quite well documented, incredibly well documented, because in 1453, the family that owned the shroud in 1355, a family, de Charny family, Geoffrey de Charny was a knight who placed the shroud on display in Lille, France, claimed it was the burial linen of Christ. We don't know how he came to possess it, but he transferred it to, or the family, the Charny family, transferred it to the House of Savoy in 1453. Some of you might know the House of Savoy is a minor dynastic family of Europe. They produced the titular kings of Italy, the last of whom was Umberto II, who died in 1983. So from 1453 until 1983, we have 530 years of unbroken, documented provenance of this cloth. Super important to understanding that provides the context for scientific evaluation to even take place. Had that not been rigorously documented, we might be questioning the provenance of the shroud that's in Turin, Italy today. Hugely important. 1453, the House of Savoy acquires this, and they own it for 530 years. In 1983, when the last of the Savoy titular kings of Italy, Umberto II, died, he willed it to the living Pope, Pope St. John Paul II. Today, it is the personal property of Pope Leo XIV. It does not belong to the institutional Catholic Church. It belongs to the Pope as an individual, okay? Very important. The next major thing that happens is that the Savoy family had it on display. And I'm going to jump forward to show you this real quick. This is their humble little chateau. Actually, this is not the chateau. This is the humble little chapel that's on the grounds of their chateau in Chambéry, France. And this is where the shroud was stored in the 16th century. You can see this little niche behind the altar there. It was stored there, and there was a fire in this chapel in 1532 that left what is, you can see the parallel set of scorch marks that run the length of the linen. That fire actually heated up the metal reliquary that the shroud was folded into, and we can actually recreate the fold lines. And we know that that left this predominantly, you see them very prominently there, the parallel scorch marks that run the entire length of the linen. Now, it's interesting what happened next is because the fire actually scorched the linen, it also created some weaknesses in the fabric itself, so much so that we know that a couple of years later, the Poor Clares, who are a sister order, obviously, to the Franciscans, the Poor Clares undertook a very loving and well-intentioned repair of this cloth by introducing, we think, perhaps even new fibers into the linen. They also sewed on a series of everyone see the parallel sort of triangular shaped patches. Those are actually patches that were sewn on in 1534. Those were removed in 2002 during a restoration. They're no longer there. But we know that the shroud, the fire caused this damage to the shroud such that the Poor Clares felt like they needed to strengthen the linen, and they also sewed on a backing cloth. Okay, so we know of several things that they did in this effort to strengthen and preserve the linen. And then we learned in the middle of the 20th century, because we became aware of what happens when you look at the shroud under ultraviolet light. And ultraviolet light is a spectrum of light, remember, that we didn't know about until the 20th century. But if you look at the shroud under ultraviolet light, something becomes glaringly apparent, and that is that most of the shroud, 99.9% of the shroud, is this homogeneous sepia tone beige color, just like you see with your naked eye when you look at it, except for one area of the linen, which is that top. If you're looking at it horizontally, it's the top left corner. If you're looking at it standing up, it's the bottom left corner. Everybody see where I have highlighted the green up here? So that's because if you look at it under ultraviolet light, that corner of the shroud actually fluoresces this bright neon green. So you can clearly see that there is something chemically very different about this part of the cloth, okay? Now, if you were my 8 o'clock freshman class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'd be looking at you and saying, did you write that down? Because that is the test question, okay? That's the test question. The most important thing you can take away today, perhaps, is remembering that there was we believe, some sort of a reweave that may have taken place. At a minimum, they introduced new fibers into the linen and tried to dye it to look the same as the rest of the cloth in the 16th century. Okay, everybody got that little factoid? That'll be important later on. So in 1578, the shroud moves to Turin, Italy, which is where it is today. It's in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It is not on public display, but 500,000 people a year still visit there. Even though it's not on public display, pilgrims make that journey. Why? What are they seeking? I think that's a great question. In 1898, we're fast forwarding a lot now, 1898, the very first shroud photograph is made by an amateur photographer by the name of Secunda Pia, who was a Turinese lawyer who approached the Savoy family, asked if he could photograph the shroud as part of a major exhibition ostension that the Savoy family was having. They told him yes. So there he is with his very sophisticated equipment. Some of you, I'm looking around the room at our demographic here. Most of us remember film. You should have seen Nora and I at World Youth Day trying to explain negative photography to young people who don't remember having to take their little film canisters perhaps and getting them developed and getting the roll of negatives back. But Secunda Pia had even older technology than we remember, right? Secunda Pia had to take a very prolonged exposure on a glass plate and then take that into a darkroom and process it chemically to bring it out in the glass. So when he did, he's the very first person in the world to ever see what was really there. Okay? He was accused of having created a hoax because this is actually the inverse of the way photographic principles work. You are looking at what is a photographic negative, but is actually a positive image of the man. When you look at the photographic positive here, like this one, you are looking now at a negative. The shroud itself, the image itself, for lack of a better way to explain this, is a photographic negative. So when you take a negative of a negative, what do you get? A positive image. It was 33 years before the House of Savoy would allow the shroud to be photographed a second time. And the second photographer, Giuseppe Henriet, got the exact same result, and every photographer ever since has gotten the exact same result. And you can see the amount of detail. This is really what opened the age of the image for the shroud, the age of scientific study and inquiry. Dates right here. Then in 1976, we realized a second, actually we knew this before, but it was demonstrated visually. In 1976, there was a project with Jet Propulsion Laboratories and involved some physicists at the Air Force Academy who were working to develop technology that could read photographs for dimensions. Very, very simple kind of analog. I wouldn't even call it technology today, but the VP8 analyzer was developed for this purpose, to read a photograph to say, you know, are we looking at a crater on the moon or is that a mountain? Is there a dimension to that? So the developers of this had the idea of taking lots of different photographs and running through the shroud, running through the analyzer as a control. Like, how does a photograph of the Mona Lisa behave under this kind of analysis? How does a photograph of a human child behave under this analysis? They took a photograph of the shroud and ran it through this analyzer, and they got a very surprising result. Remember, I told you it reads for spatial relationships. It reads for dimension. And when they ran a photograph of the shroud through this analyzer, they got this result, which is to say that it's three-dimensional actually misses the point. It's not just that. It's not just that we can take that information and extract it and create a three-dimensional image, although you'll see that on display out here, okay? There is an exact and direct proportional relationship, spatially embedded, between the distance the body was from the cloth and the density of the image itself. So think about it this way. The most dense parts of the image would be like the tip of the nose or the tip of the knees that we know came in direct contact, the hands, that came in direct contact with the cloth. That's readable for dimension. The back of the knees did not come into contact with the cloth, but yet there's an image there. But we can read the proportionality, that spatial relationship, and we know that there's a three-dimensional form in the cloth when the image was created. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? I encourage you, highly encourage you, if you've not already done so, to go out and look at the body model, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Well, this caused, of course, everyone in the room to look at each other and go, we're taking a team of scientists to Turin. And that happened actually in 1978, which I'll talk about, because of these two unique imaging features. There's nothing else in the world that has exclusively these two imaging features that make it unlike anything else ever photographed or imaged, is that the eye sees the photographic negative. You're looking at a photographic negative when you're looking at it with your eye. Nothing else images that way. And the fact that we have this, obviously, this information that's embedded in the very top microfibrils of this linen. It's so superficial you could scrape it off with a razor blade. But yet it contains all the complexity of this data, these wounds, this incredible detail of the man who was wrapped in this linen. The 1978 research project, actually I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. These are some findings that were published throughout into the early 1980s is when you first began to see this in peer-reviewed journals, and into the late 1980s, and then everything that came out of this 1978 project, including many of the samples that are being used today for analysis, all were taken in 1978. It's all's built on that, okay? The linen covered an actual human form. We know that because of that spatial relationship we talked about. It was a male, approximately 5'10" tall, about 170 pounds. I've seen this, some speculate the weight as low as 160, some as high as 175, but you get the picture. I mean, I think we can all sort of agree on the height of the man. Forensically, anatomically, perfect form. In other words, not perfect in the sense that any of us are perfect, but perfect in the sense that it's a real human being, okay? It's a crucified man who was capped with thorns. There are 50-plus small puncture wounds at the forehead and the top of the head and the nape of the neck, telling us that there was something on this man's head that punctured the skin, almost, predictable pattern, visual pattern. One wrist is pierced. You can see that the other one is hidden from view. The left wrist is pierced. There's an upward thrust wound right here in the thoracic cavity, right on the right side. Now, what's interesting about this, it's right between the fifth and the sixth ribs. And you can even see it with the naked eye. You can certainly visualize this much better under close-up examination, that there is a separation of blood and clear fluid at that wound site, which tells us that this was a post-mortem wound, okay? And the feet obviously pierced with a large object. You can see. All right? This is actually an enhanced image, artificially enhanced, to show the 360-ish wounds that are on the body that are identical from a specific type of weapon. We can replicate sort of the pattern forensically that this man was beaten with a specific weapon. This is also CSI. We also know from the wounds and their distribution that this man was slightly bent at his waist, his arms were in front of him, and there were two men beating him. Each one had a weapon, and one of these men was taller than the other. So how do we know all that? Because again, all of this information can be extracted forensically from the blood flow, blood spatter, and actually you can visualize those wounds microscopically, and they're all identical. They're all caused by the same type of weapon. So if you were going to try to recreate a weapon forensically that might match something that would create this wound distribution, of every time this man was struck, there were 6 wounds left in a very specific pattern, because there's a weapon that has 3 straps, perhaps ropes, perhaps strings, that each one of those had on the end of it a tiny irregular little ball, okay? That matches the wound pattern on the shroud. Again, I encourage you to go see the exhibit, because there's the weapon. If you were going to reconstruct what that weapon might look like, that's it. All right, so this forensic body model is based on that 3D image. This one is a little more bloody and a little more perhaps graphic than the one you'll see out in the hallway out there. But this has got all the wound placement. You can see right here, there is the wound in the right side. Obviously, you can see the position of the knees and the feet, the flexion of the neck. So it is the opinion of many forensic scientists that the body was in rigor mortis when it was placed in the shroud. So that gives us kind of a specific kind of window to look at as to when the image could have been formed, because rigor mortis is a limited medical process. It resolves, sets in a couple of hours after death, begins to, and it resolves almost completely within 40 to 46 hours, generally speaking. So you can place that in a timeline if you need to, but the body was still in rigor mortis when the image was formed. The blood is present before the image, and I think we need to stop just a moment and think about that. The man bled, and then the image was formed. Okay, the blood was present before the image was there, and the blood actually penetrates the entire linen, of course. The linen is very porous. It collects this blood and fluid, the clear fluid, both from the nose and mouth area and also from the side. But yet the image does not penetrate the entire depth of the linen. Okay? So the image is only on those very, very top fibrils of the linen. So this was the Stirp conclusion that they published in the early 1980s, and this is a direct quote, that the image is not a painting or a photograph. There are no paints or pigments or dyes to account for the image, and for now the image formation process remains a mystery. And I love that word. The Greek is mysterion. It's used throughout the New Testament. It's used by the Greek fathers of the church who are writing. Mysterion is something that we don't know, yes, something we don't know, but there's a beautiful nuance in the Greek to the word mysterion that I want you to kind of maybe even take away from here today and think about. The beautiful nuance is it's something that hasn't been revealed yet, okay? It's a mystery to us now. In other words, it's hidden, it's obscured from us now, but it just hasn't been revealed yet. That's the beautiful nuance of that word in Greek. So the cloth itself is very interesting. It's a beautiful 3/1 herringbone weave. People who have seen this up close, I know will agree with me. It's a very beautiful weave. It's visible with the naked eye. You don't have to look at it microscopically. It's obviously there. This differs from other cloths that have been used for these purposes because it is an expensive one. It's very simple to just weave 1/1/1 and make a very simple and mass-produced linen that way. This one was a masterly crafted to be this specific, beautiful weave, 3/1, making it unlike anything really we have a sample of. So whoever this man was who was such a criminal that he deserved this horrific death, he got a very nice burial linen. He got a very expensive burial linen. Whoever owned this linen was a person of means, okay? Now, this is preliminary. I mentioned this preliminary. 2024, we had this isotope testing that Dr. Bill Meacham did, who is a retired archaeologist. I suppose he's an archaeology professor emeritus from Hong Kong University, who, on the board that I serve on, STERA, we have some samples of the shroud that were taken in 1978 from that 1978 research project I mentioned. Barry Schwartz, who was the founder of STERA and the documenting photographer on that project, had permission to retain and to keep these samples. And so we had them, and there was, and still have some, but there was a question always about what we could do to advance our knowledge of the shroud. People would always come and ask, can I have a sample of the shroud for this, or can I have a sample of the shroud for that? And as a board, we never really felt like we had heard something that was convincing enough, that would advance our knowledge enough in a way that was non-destructive, that might contribute to our understanding. And then we had Bill Meacham, who argued that we could take samples of the shroud and isotope test them, and we could get a geographic bead, like where this flax linen was grown. And ladies, you all know this, when you go to the store and you buy those 100% Egyptian cotton sheets, how do you know they're 100% Egyptian cotton? Because they've been isotope tested. They've been isolated to that specific region. So this sounded like very good information that we should pursue. So we submitted to that. This is preliminary. I do want to stress that. It is in the process of being published and peer-reviewed. We're going to try to replicate what Dr. Meacham found, which is this, that the geographic origin of the linen is somewhere in this zone that you see, the red zone. Probably the most likely origin, the darker red that you see is the more likely. We cannot exclude, from this testing at least, we cannot exclude the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates River. We cannot exclude as far west and south as the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, but this is something that's, again, that's coming forth, that's new, that's promising, that's opening up new scientific inquiry. We also know that the blood on the shroud is human. I do stress human. It is type AB. There is good scientific consensus about this. Okay, don't ask me about DNA. That's really not an open question. But this is what we do know. It's real human blood, and that makes it a forensic match for another relic. This relic is held in Oviedo, Spain, called the sudarium, or sweat cloth, that's held in Oviedo, Spain. This relic arrived there in northern Spain in the year 614. It's got a very well-documented history. In case you're wondering, okay, what is a sweat cloth? Go to the 20th chapter of John's Gospel, and you'll remember that John is the only one who gives us an important detail. John is the only one who says, when he and Peter ran to the tomb, they saw the burial linen lying there, including the cloth that had covered Jesus' head that was rolled up in a separate place by itself. Do y'all remember that piece of detail? John's the only one who mentions it. And the word that he uses for that cloth is sudarium. In the Greek, it means a sweat cloth. It's something that any man who worked outside would have worn. He probably would have worn it on his head, tucked it in his belt. This cloth arrived in a reliquary that was purported to have belonged to the Apostle James. It came out of the Holy Land, out of Jerusalem, in advance of the Persian invasions of the early 7th century. It arrived in Oviedo, Spain, and we know where it's been ever since. We have this unbroken chain of custody for it. So this is what we know about that. We know where it shows up. Y'all forgive the use of CE. You can tell I work in a secular classroom. Forgive that. Just overlook that. You know I mean 614 AD, Anno Domini. Can I get an amen? Yes. It arrived in this ancient reliquary that was purported to have belonged to the Apostle James. As I mentioned, it's the same blood type that's on the shroud. There are 20 plus points of blood spatter, blood flow congruity between the shroud and the sudarium, which is more than you need to introduce into a court of law that these cloths covered the face of the same man. Okay? CSI. Same blood type, by the way, which AB, depending on whether it's positive or negative, we're still talking about less than 4 to 5% of the population that would have that blood type. It's the rarest blood type. So what are the odds? There are identical pollens that are found. We used to believe that these were unique to Jerusalem. That is in some question now. But there are identical pollens. I could say it this way. There are identical pollens on each cloth that are found in Jerusalem. How's that sound? Okay? And it covered the face of the same individual. Now, speaking of the pollen, real quickly, Dr. Max Fry in 1973 was the very first to be able to analyze pollens from the shroud. He identified 56 different ones. He identified 7 of them that he believed were unique to the Middle East, including this one, Gandelia tourneforti, which is a blooming thorn. Dr. Avanin Danin in the Hebrew University verified Dr. Fry's finding of this in 1998. This was published in peer-reviewed journals, okay? So sort of his statement about this was, you can see this, using my database of 90,000 plant locations, he said, the place that best fits these plant species have been identified on the shroud is 10 to 20 kilometers east and west of Jerusalem. That's Dr. Danin's scholarly opinion about the pollen. Now, this has recently come into question that there is actually a new pollenology techniques that are allowing them to microscopically sort of get a better view, and this perhaps is broadening a bit in terms of their actual, are we really talking about specific to Jerusalem, or are we talking about perhaps a broader area? So stay tuned about that. Scientific information is always seeking consensus, so you'll see a consensus begin to build around the truth of this, for sure. The soil that is on the shroud that was vacuumed, I always shudder when I think about this. Can you imagine taking a vacuum to the shroud and just vacuuming up particles, particulate off of it? That's what they did in 1978. And again in 2002. But the interesting thing is that when the original sort of vacuuming of the shroud took place, they took what appeared to be soil and placed it in a little like plastic baggie and labeled it, guess what? Dirt. Real scientific, isn't it? Dirt. But we now know that there is, obviously, soils have unique geographic signatures, and this is one scholarly investigation places this particular travertine aragonite has been identified, which is, actually might have a broad distribution throughout the Mediterranean world. This is not necessarily travertine that comes from Europe, that matches, for instance, anything you might find in Northern Europe especially. It's a very different signature. But this points to a specific area around the Mediterranean. And it has been hypothesized that because the largest concentration of this soil was found at the eyes and the bridge of the nose and around the hairline, that this person face planted into the dirt, probably suffering a pretty severe fall, but without something to break his fall, in other words. So it's been, again, hypothesized by, in 1986, it was proposed by a group of scientists that this was a match to Jerusalem. They found samples from the shroud that there is no lead, which gives it another unique kind of geographic signature, pointing to this place in Jerusalem. And it is travertine aragonite and not calcite, which also points to it being more localized to Jerusalem. This is suggestive evidence only. I would not call this conclusive. I think this is still being studied, okay, as our technologies begin to emerge. But this is suggestive of the cloth, obviously, having been in Jerusalem at some point in its history. Now, this was the sticky widget in 1988. Y'all look what I did there. I got it right, AD. That the carbon-14 dating results that were done, 3 laboratories, University of Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona in the United States, came together, got permission to carbon-14 date the cloth, and this was their press conference in October of that year announcing their results. Now, I want to see if anybody else notices something about what's written on the blackboard. Thank you. Y'all got that right away, the exclamation point. So science is supposed to be an objective measure of natural phenomena, correct? Why do you need to punctuate it? I always thought that was maybe some scientific notation I never learned because I was a liberal arts major. I missed that one day in science class. But this actually made headlines around the world. The Shroud of Turin is a medieval forgery, And we see that date between 1260 and 1390. And I think many people stepped away from the shroud, and actually we lost an entire generation. We lost an entire generation of opportunity to teach about this cloth, to evangelize using this cloth, and for some of us, just the opportunity to study it in a way that was honest and upheld the integrity of what you would expect from an academic discipline. People stepped away from it. Well, not me, but some people did. A lot of people did. Because all the other information was coming out, there were those who felt like that this information was not congruent with everything else we knew. How is it that there is these specific pollens? How do we have this blood evidence? How do we have this soil evidence on a cloth, to mention nothing about the complexity of the image, by the way, on a cloth that supposedly dates to the earliest time would be the 13th century. So in 2017, beginning in 2017, Tristan Casabianca, a young French lawyer working with a team actually they published together. Tristan is the one who made the call to the British Museum and asked for all of the raw data from the 1988 test, because he was actually in sort of a process of discernment himself. He attended a lecture on the shroud and felt very drawn to it, converted to Christianity, and wanted to see the carbon-14 results. So the British Museum, the custodian of all that raw data, told him no. So he did what any lawyer would do, right? He sued them. Under the International Freedom of Information Act, forced them to release the data. And the data, when it was released, and to Oxford's credit, they published it. That's their journal, Archaeometry, published this in 2019. It is a pretty severe indictment, not just of the carbon-14 dating results, but of the protocol that was not followed. Okay? So the protocol was this: that each laboratory would receive 2 samples. Those samples would be taken individually, 6 samples in all, taken from across the linen in places that did not touch upon the image. Okay? They would do their testing separately. They would not compare their results. And what Tristan uncovered in the protocol alone is enough to indict this entire process, because they took one sample and they cut it into 6 pieces. Okay, does everybody know that's not the same thing? Okay, just because you take one sample and cut it into 6 does not make 6 samples. So you have 6 pieces that are representative of one specific part of that linen. And here's a test question. Where would you think that one little sample was taken from? Okay, good, y'all were paying attention. You had 14.5 feet, and you took your sample from the one area of the linen that everyone knew was chemically different from the rest of it. Okay? So this is what's led to non-destructive testing techniques that are going on now. This wide-angle X-ray scattering I mentioned earlier, which actually measures that deterioration of the cellulose. It is not destructive. It is very promising. This is being replicated in a couple of different laboratories right now. They're repeating what they've done and repeating it. And we are getting a first century date plus or minus 100 years, right? So let me go back to that. The image formation we know was caused by a light source. There is a light that actually dehydrates the linen fibers themselves, takes all the moisture out of it. And it's in this dehydration, this chemical reaction to the light, that leaves the image itself on the very top fibrils of that cloth, yeah? So what we understand, maybe hypothetically, the process that produced the image. The problem is we cannot reproduce it. We cannot reproduce it except theoretically, except hypothetically. We understand the math, we understand the chemistry, but we don't really have a human subject we can test this on, which makes that problematic. Theoretical physics offers us some answers. I always use this one because it's the easiest one to explain. There are several other physicists out there who have theoretical explanations for this. Dr. John Jackson's is pretty straightforward. He was the nuclear physicist I mentioned who was working with Jet Propulsion Laboratories in 1976 on the VP8 analyzer. Dr. Jackson suggests that the body that was wrapped in this linen became mechanically transparent. In other words, it was pure light. And now that the body is pure light, it has all of the form of the man, but none of its mass. So the cloth simply collapsed through the body, straight through the plane of gravity, capturing an image on the front and on the back in a immeasurable, almost millisecond. So you say, okay, how immeasurable is that millisecond? Well, in 2011, Dr. Paulo de Lazaro, working with an excimer laser, after many tries, was able to demonstrate that you can achieve the exact penetration depth in the linen, exactly, that's on the shroud. And he's only working with about a postage stamp size piece of linen, so he doesn't replicate a body. But he does repeat or replicate the image depth. And this is the math. 1/100th billionth of a second of the pulse of the laser. So if the laser pulsed less than that, you don't get an image of this depth. If you pulse more than that, you destroy the linen. 1/100th billionth of a second. And can you even wrap your head around that? An immeasurable millisecond is the amount of contact that this linen had with this light source. 1/100th billionth of a second. Another interesting thing that I always like to sort of wrap with, I find this, it's theologically interesting to me, it's scientifically interesting to me, historically interesting to the extent that I know of no other image on a cloth that would do this. But if you place the shroud in front of a light source, in other words, you transmit light through the linen, the image disappears. You can see the blood, see the blood stains. Barry Schwartz actually, this is his photograph from the 1978 project. There's no optical density in the image that blocks the transmission of light. And I think that's a profound question to ask. What would disappear in transmitted light, if not light itself? It's a great question. It's a physics question. It's a theological question. We could talk more about that if we had more time. All right. So what I'm going to leave you with is this. We have really only one of two answers to this question. This is either the authentic burial linen of Christ. Okay, it's either that. Could it be a natural remain of a supernatural event? Could it be a physical remain of a metaphysical event created by some process we don't understand and can't replicate in the 21st century and would never be able to replicate because it's of a light source that we cannot harness on this planet to do? As a matter of fact, that 1/100th billionth of a second I referenced, that is not a natural phenomenon that we can replicate without the use of a laser in the 21st century. Okay, so it's either that. There's really only one other thing it can be. If it's not that, then it has to be an ancient or medieval artwork. And if it is an ancient or medieval artwork, we have a lot of questions we need to answer. We need to answer how someone in the Middle Ages could do this by an image formation process that we don't understand today, how they could harness that kind of light, but a process that required some pretty exacting knowledge about human anatomy, blood spatter forensics, and negative photography. All of those questions must be answered for it to be number two. So we're really pulled, as I mentioned, we're pulled into this place where we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. And there's something about that divine logos that dwells in us, right? That the same thing we bring to bear on answering an algebra equation or balancing the checkbook or trying to answer a question about the shroud, it's the same thing that drives us to want to understand as much as we can. What is that about? Because we have clearly reached an impasse with this particular artifact. We don't have the answers. And the more we do have answers, the more questions we have. So it's a place of mystery. It's a place of mystery. And again, that's kind of where I want to leave us with that. Now, obviously, I'm going to put this disclaimer up here. No, we cannot rule out some unknown natural process, right? There's some unknown natural process that might have produced this of a crucified man who was pierced in the right side, capped with thorns, beaten with a very specific weapon. That's the only one of this natural process experiments that has survived in the world. Okay? So there's where we are. We are back in the realm of mystery. We're in the realm of mystery. And whenever you're in the presence of mystery, people, you're already in the presence of something greater than yourselves. Thank you very much.